All right, to discuss further, we're joined by senior legal journalist Karyn Maughn. Karyn, great to chat to you as always. So what's your take? After nearly 2 decades, who is responsible for delaying this case this time?
Well, in this particular matter, it's really a question of this application for further particulars by the former president and French arms company Thales, which the state contends will cause a substantive amount of time in providing those documents. But by the same token, Francis, the state maintained that it would be ready in April for the trial. So it's contention now that these potential hiccups could result in it being unable to do so, is indicative perhaps of an underestimation of the kind of work involved. Also, Billy Downer is saying very at pains to say that the real impact had been felt by the state because of the COVID pandemic, that it had been unable to do meetings, gather the information, for example, that has been requested by Thales. In many respects, they're asking for documentation that was preserved on very old formats, as I understand, like CDs, things like that. They now need to try and find ways of accessing that information. But the biggest issue, of course, is that Thales has brought an application to try and review the decision to charge both itself and, of course, the former president with racketeering. It's bringing this case on its own behalf. And conservatively speaking, legal commentators I've spoken to said that kind of matter, if it's appealed or subject to multiple appeals, could go on for up to 2 years. Sure. So in this particular instance, it's not Zuma or the state. It's actually the French arms company that's accused of trying to bribe the former president.
Okay, so we could almost have now a trial, mini one, before the trial begins. Just tell us what their objections are to the racketeering charges.
Well, Francis, first of all, racketeering is an immensely serious charge. It's the most serious charge that Jacob Zuma and Thales is facing. It's essentially that you are part of the criminal enterprise, that operates in conjunction in order to commit ongoing offences. It's typically used in the scenario of organised crime, people who are running drug operations or protection syndicates. It's not something that we see a lot. It's recently emerged in the VBS case. But in the case where the state chooses to pursue a racketeering charge, it needs to issue what's called a racketeering certificate. And that certificate needs to be based on a whole record of evidence that leads the state to believe that all the individuals involved, in this particular instance, Thales, Shabir Sheikh, Zuma's former financial advisor, and Zuma himself, were intentionally part of the so-called organized criminal operation. Now, Barry Rue telling the court today that he had sought this evidence or information that the state relied on to make this decision from the NPA. Thales starting, he said, in February this year to get that information. As yet, it has not been provided to them. And I think and Thales will contend that, in fact, the decision to charge them with racketeering was defective because that record of evidence simply does not exist. And we've seen challenges like this in the past with Johan Boysen, for example, with the Cato Manor case, which caused all kinds of repercussions for then former acting NPA head Nonko Bojiba. So it's going to be a very big battle, and it may have profound implications, not just for Thales, but for Zuma himself.
All right, and another test for the NPA. So the former president, Jacob Zuma, was in court, but talk of this previous arrest warrant, the sick notes, just tell us how that was resolved.
Essentially what had happened was on the 4th of February, Jacob Zuma had not been in court because of alleged health problems. His then attorney, Daniel Mancha, had handed in a so-called sick note, which Judge Daya Pillay refused to accept on the basis that it was simply inadequate. She then put in place a suspended arrest warrant and suggested there may be an inquiry into Zuma's non-presence at court. Today, the Surgeon General of the South African National Defence Force, which is, of course, the entity that looks after the former president's health, submitted a letter in which he confirmed with a signature that, in fact, the former president had not been well and therefore had been receiving treatment. And this was the explanation for his non-presence in court. That was accepted by Judge Kate Pillay, and she simply cancelled the arrest warrant. So no longer that arrest warrant hanging over the former president's head.
And finally, explain his mood, the mood in court, the supporters outside, considering we are in COVID-19 times.
Well, if one considers that, in the normal course of events, court hearings should not be taking place at all, and it actually been ordered by the judge president that these hearings would not take place unless the matter was urgent, it gives you an indication of how poor the relationship is between the state and the defense that this hearing happened in any event. Very subdued hearing, none of the sort of support, small numbers of people gathering, but definitely not on the scale. Obviously, gatherings of over 50 people are prohibited. But Jacob Zuma, very much in fighting spirits, greeting everyone in the courtroom. Obviously, a far lesser amount of people than previously, but definitely a new spectre to this case. Instead of, these ongoing fights about whether or not the prosecution was too tainted to continue, the fight is now that he wants the prosecution to continue. He's saying he will prove that he is in fact innocent, that he's been used as a quote-unquote scapegoat for arms deal corruption that he contends is completely unfair, and clearly in a space where he now wants the case to continue. But of course, given the Thales application, given these outstanding issues, that is unlikely to happen anytime soon, and definitely not this year as he hoped it would be.
All right. Thank you very much, senior legal journalist Karyn Maughn.